standing for the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and his wife, Sabina Higgins.
President Higgins and Sabina, public representatives, Chief Executive of Sligo County Council Martin Lydon, Mary Henry and the members of the Tubbercurry Connaught Rangers Memorial Group, Mr. Donal Tinney, Decade of Centenaries Coordinator, and fellow members of the Decade of Centenaries Committee, and of course our special guests, the families of the Connaught Rangers. Friends, it is a privilege as Leas Cathaoirleach of Sligo County Council to welcome President and Sabina Higgins to Tubbercurry on behalf of the Cathaoirleach and members of Sligo County Council and the people of Sligo. Your presence here today enhances our ceremony and is deeply appreciated by our community. In particular, the families of the Connaught Rangers who are here with us today. It is a day of reflection, a day of shared pride for families and communities, a day when memories are treasured, and through this monument, preserved for people to pay their silent and respectful tribute. The level of preparation that has brought this project to fruition can scarcely be imagined, but our thanks and appreciation goes out to all those who represent the voluntary spirit of Tubbercurry, and indeed all of Sligo. The evidence is here to see today, as it is in every community across our great county. Even against that backdrop, the project team has done exemplary work to make the family's elusive dream a reality today. The story of the mutiny in India could have been a brief historical footnote without the commendable work of the Tubbercurry Connaught Rangers Memorial Group and their support from the Sligo Decade of Centenaries Committee. Through your efforts, we now understand the political and historical context of the time and appreciate how significant events in their home country informed the actions of the mutineers. They were men of resilience and courage, many of whom sacrificed their lives in defence of their resolute convictions. Some of the testimonials recounted from that time are difficult and harrowing, such as those offered by the Clare native Michael Carney. We can only speculate on the traumas these brave men suffered and the scars that accompanied them for the rest of their lives. 100 years on, the most fitting means we have as a community in the presence of our President to honour their legacy, to research and recount their stories, and to preserve them for future generations. For many years, the families of the Connaught Rangers fought to have their contribution recognised. The endeavour reached its first milestone with the passing of the Connaught Rangers Pension Act in 1936, providing for the payment of pensions and allowances to former members. The effect of this was to grant them parity with the veterans of our own War of Independence. From a catchment area on Europe's most western outpost, the valour and resilience of the Connaught Rangers was displayed on battlefields from Gallipoli to Sudan to the Western Front in the Great War. Today, in the company of our President, we solemnly recall the Indian Mutiny of June 1920, and in particular, the part played by the County Sligo soldiers. In the centuries since, their families and a number of historians have been informed and persuasive advocates for the Connaught Rangers and have kept their memory in the public domain. This memorial project is part of Sligo County Council's Decade of Centenaries and the state commemoration of significant historical events that took place between 1918 and 1923. On this day of reflection and commemoration, I will conclude by thanking President Higgins for gracing us with his presence, and a special word of thanks to the dedicated people serving on the Tubbercurry Connaught Rangers Memorial Group, the staff of County Sligo Library Service, and the Sligo Decade of Centenaries Committee. You can all take great pride on this special day for our community. Gorman.
Thank you, Leas Cathaoirleach. I now invite the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, to deliver his keynote address.
A gwyniwsler yn gydal sias sfeddil am gywil cwynsi. An áhas am fe'n sialef. Agus tres liam lef a sactan cwy yn y ffrastar siad y jacrach de Iesuile o hefyn o coet sia egrwg ac o hor hen yw'r efeisio planawd agus nir a sians ac i dal yr ai tisgraf mwyd gylier I lor Covid. Ac tomwyd yn sio hynnyw. Agus is míl am gwycas a go le Mary Henry, Jerry Landy agus Kevin Burke on gwysda cymora Kathleen Cianar Connaught. As often yn geidr sias yn cwyra a hiol siid dan port a glachos yn ocod yn yw. Agus mar a gwrt me ffyrfi gwyl yn ocod y torlw ffyera. Dar nwy is intag yn rodel agus yn tîm go hamlawn leis yn Leas Cathaoirleach on tofod y ta bwyntli erach ti dionach. May I just, as I have just been saying, what a great pleasure it is to be here, and that you have managed to put on this event which came under such great difficulties because of COVID. And in addition to that as well, I very much agree, as I have just said with your Vice Chairman, about the importance of voluntary work. I think I do want, as I have just thanked Mary Henry and Jerry Land and Kevin Burke for their invitation to be here today, and Sabine and I are very pleased to join you. So, may I begin by expressing my deepest appreciation for having received a copy of the personal handwritten account of the Connaught Rangers mutiny by Joseph Hawes, one of the leaders of the mutiny, as well as a typical, and I think that he had been, on leave in County Clare, and he had witnessed particular actions that took place. I think as well I had sent to me a typed version, courtesy of Catherine Milliard, granddaughter of mutineer Corporal Joseph O'Donoghue. So mille buicas asacht na letracha sin hiolodom. Thank you very much for forwarding this to me. I am very conscious of the many public representatives who are here. I salute you all. I'm very conscious of the representatives indeed from different representatives of the stage. I think it's very important that we recognise public representatives, but particularly this is such an important occasion for those who are related to the men whose names will be placed on the memorial. It uses a special day, and also for all those who worked in the committee over the years in trying to arrive at this point. Our event here in Tubbercurry is an important event, marking as it does, as we said, the centenary of the Connaught Rangers mutiny. And as we will informally unveil the memorial stone, bearing as it does the four names of the famous mutineers from Sligo, we must recall their courage, their principled response to news of the abuse of their fellow Irish as they served the empire far away from home in Ireland. And I think it has been shown again and again in the recent reworkings of our history that the perception of an event and the reaction to it becomes even more important than the event itself. I have been dealing with such issues through the Mutiny series, and we will be resuming our Mutiny series on the 25th of November. We're as far as number 4, and we'll be dealing with roughly the same period as your commemoration deals with. We'll then go on to number 5 and number 6, which deal with the foundation of the state. but the act of civil and military disobedience and defiance that the Connaught Rangers mutiny represents continues to resonate in 21st century Ireland. Yes, it has been the subject of books, radio and television programmes, plays and ballads, with the mutineers commemorated as Irish heroes in our struggle for independence. We will have a lot of, it is part of the Decade of Commemorations, but there is such a lot of work to do. We don't do so to make judgments. We look, in fact, to interpret and seek to understand the people in a particular context. And it is very interesting. I think that historical memories of the 1920 mutiny illuminate not only the politics of commemoration in a later independent Ireland, but they also reflect what was shared in both the experience of imperialism and indeed anti-imperial relationship by such countries as India, South Africa, and many others. And all these issues really pose with questions as to the uses of memory as we make the movement from recollection to accounts to collective purposes and even iconic invocation. I'm very struck myself by the importance it attaches to we not imposing our context on their context. As I was driving up and thinking of the people who took this action in the Connaught Rangers, they are in a particular circumstance, and what they do is important in their lives and in their families. And I think while there's much speculation as to how much did they know of this and how much they didn't know, what they did know, and it is very interesting, that maybe one of the most significant events of that period was the murder of Mrs. Eileen Quinn, holding her as she held her baby, waiting for her husband to come home from the fair in Gort, tenants as they were on Lady Gregory's estate. It's very interesting to actually, time doesn't allow me now, but if you take the case of Mrs. Eileen Quinn, it is one that is raised in parliaments, and it is one that's very interesting, that becomes known in India. And it is that I mean, that the perception and news of an event becomes even more important than the event itself. It is clear that Mr. Hawes, for example, would have known of Eileen Quinn's death. And what took place then, I think, which is very important, is that the mutiny is a fascinating story of an extraordinary act of defiance. It constitutes, as I said, both historical fact and symbol. The Connaught Rangers were one of 8 Irish Line infantry regiments in the British Army, raised largely in Ireland with its home depot stationed in Rainmore Barracks, wherein my uncle was served the National Army 1922 to 1925, while at the same time my father was in Tintown 3 in the Curragh incarceration. News did not travel fast in the 1920s, but it is very clear, and it is very from the Indian newspaper accounts of the time, that the violence that had been unleashed in particular by the Black and Tans was available to Irish-born soldiers who were serving in the British Army in India. And on this, as we do the tasks of reconstruction as well, it is very important to bear in mind why these families were serving, as so many were, serving in the British Army and serving really in the tasks of empire. People were seeking to make a life from poverty. People were seeking to make a life of security for their family, something I'll return to in a moment. And therefore, we must understand all of that. It is interesting to know that of the 56,000 soldiers who would form the National Army, approximately half would have been people who had military service, and certainly represented about a fifth of the officer class. On the 28th of June 1920, a company of Connaught Rangers stationed at Jalandhar in the Palms on the plains of the Punjab in India refused to perform their military duties as a protest against martial law, oppression, and the atrocities of the British Army in Ireland, atrocities which included as I have just said, the shooting of Mrs. Quinn. It is one of the great acts of reconciliation, I think, that Gerard Quinn, grandson of Eileen Quinn, and of the soldier who fired the shot at her, have met and have talked about the significance of that event. But the protesters returning them were soon joined, I think, by other Rangers, including several English soldiers. You might say, too, it isn't a case of sorting out anyone's particular motivation. But at the time, there was an abhorrence of the authoritarian and humiliating practices which had been reported very particularly by the serving soldiers, and which were perceived not only by them, but by newspapers in Britain and elsewhere, as in fact besmirching the reputation of soldiering and nation alike. And when by the following morning a rebel muster took place, 300 soldiers were involved in the mutiny. On the 30th of June 2020, the mutineers sent 2 envoys to a company of Connaught Rangers stationed at Sligo, 20 miles away, in the foothills of the Himalayas. And it's worth thinking about your people whose names are inscribed, about that is where they are, in the foothills of the Himalayas. But they're still capable of acting on a moral moment, of hearing of the news of what had happened back in their own country. The soldiers took up the protest, and similarly to their counterparts at Jalandhar, they refused to carry out assigned duties, flew the tricolour of Ireland, wore Sinn Féin rosettes on their British Army uniforms, and sang rebel songs. While initially peaceful, the protests soon turned violent, and on the evening of the 1st of July, around 30 members of the company at Solon attempted to recapture their rifles from the company magazine. The soldiers on guard opened fire, killing 2 men and wounding another. The incident effectively brought the mutiny to an end, and the mutineers at both Jalandhar and Solon were placed under armed guard. In total, some 61 men were convicted for their role in the mutiny, with 14 sentenced to death by firing squad, but the only soldier whose capital sentence was carried out was that of Private James Joseph Daly, considered to be the leader of the mutiny at Solon, and the man responsible for the failed attack on the magazine. On the morning of the 2nd of November 1920, Daly was executed in Dachshai prison in northern India. Now, shortly after the events occurred, the story of the Connaught Rangers mutiny began to take shape, and it has become understood as an anti-imperial protest, an act of Indo-Irish solidarity. The mutineers' actions were really celebrated in song and story as actions of courageous republicanism. After all, at that particular time, they were from a country where the song sheet was very important and ballads were composed. And they became thus a part of a rich oral culture, with different balladeers writing their own version, such as J.C. Keane of Tull's Pass, writing that the mutineers' goal, quote, the dream light of freedom, shone red through their young leader's blood. And on he goes, and he speaks of his ashes, alas, he lies sleeping, afar o'er the ocean's wild tide, but his memory green we are keeping in the old land for which he has died. And Ireland's true sons and true daughters, a prayer for Jim Daly shall breathe, who sleeps by the Ganges' dark waters, so far from his own loved Westmeath. Now, it's very interesting to think in this way when we do history, is that we have to treat to understand it in all of its complexity. And while there is some contestation with regard, and this is sometimes appears just a little tedious, as to what were the particular motivations and how much do they know. Yes, it is of interest, but it doesn't take from the significance of their moral judgment at hearing what they had heard and that they were prepared to act on it. There is no doubt that the mutineers certainly knew that their actions would have serious repercussions, including financial consequences for their families. And this indicates that their intentions were at the very least politically motivated, and possibly for a variety of reasons. proper exploration of our differences, past and present, will come after all when we can appreciate each other's, when we can appreciate each other's multiple motivations. For example, many of the Connaught Rangers were veterans of the First World War. I think some of them really, they had joined, many cases, not because they had advanced views of the importance of empire, but for reasons of income and of ultimately earning a pension that could be spent on their families. Yes, they were denied a military pension by the British government, and yes, it is in 1936 that the Irish government intervened and passed the Connaught Rangers Pensions Act, guaranteeing a state pension to those sentenced by the British General Court Martial to death, penal servitude, or imprisonment for any term of not less than 12 months. The 12 months requirement is interesting. It is reflective of something very important, and that is a kind of an inherited notion of deservingness, which would plague the new Irish state. The idea that you could exercise judgment on who was deserving and exclude others who were assumed not to be deserving. And a bureaucratic flair takes off, which will guide the operations of the 1930 review of the pensions report. And when you will see that yourselves, I think, when you're reading these accounts. Calculation without purpose would start, and would you get a kind of a Kafkaesque investigation of asking people to produce their papers, produce witnesses, give accounts, checked as to their accounts. And thus, in the same way as you had to have 12 months service for that particular relief in 36, some people would not receive pensions until 25 years after their initial application. It is so important, I think, to try and encounter the texture, the human texture of all of the people when we do these tasks of memory. It is important for us to try and put ourselves into the circumstances of the people who were, with all of their contradictions. And it is very important as well, I think, that the men and women who fought for Irish independence, that bureaucratic system of 34 to 36, allowed some of them to sink into poverty, and it allowed others to pack up and simply emigrate from the country altogether. And thus, it's important when we work on this decade of commemorations that we do so with fullness, and very particularly include the exclusions, including women. Any critical examination of the historiography of this turbulent time in our history must attempt to salvage back and put back those lost authentic elements within Ireland's rich and diverse nationalist tradition that are most meaningful for us today, elements from which we might draw a new knowledge, emancipatory potential, might foster an ethical remembrance and an ethical purpose that we so need. I think it is proper investigation of our differences, past and present, will come when we can appreciate each other's perspectives. Part of the key to this lies in understanding how we each view the past, for the history of Ireland must never be closed. It must be kept open. It is a history, after all, that comprises many different interconnected stories whose exploration we engage in. And I think if we're to achieve a sophistication in this, we need to usefully draw from must respect the complexity as we craft some kind of shared future. There is something about all of this commemoration that is very, very important. The words of our ancestors are their words, and they in fact differed from each other, and it's from their world and their context that we must try and understand them. But we are responsible not for their words, we are responsible for our own words and for our own actions. And I think in taking responsibility for all our different options as to how we're in the present and the future, we are not required to develop an amnesia about what were important moral actions and words for people in their time, in their context. So the historical narrative of the period is complex, and I think that therefore in the many perspectives and interpretations of these seminal events in our nation's history, it is so important to try and achieve the gift of ethical remembering. I think that we should very particularly, and I'm coming to this, my final point, what's missing so far above all else is the view from below. If you are without work, if you have few options, no more than, for example, a life in the RIC in its time, it offered an opportunity of education, offered an opportunity of security, it offered an opportunity perhaps of a pension or whatever. How can we not seek to understand the attempts that people made in the conditions to which they had been reduced in the absence of being an independent state? They exercised their choices trying to make a fist of life. We don't abuse their experience, and we don't abuse their words or their actions. We have our responsibilities today and tomorrow, but we are not required to realize what empire was, wherever it was, be it in India, or South Africa, or Malaya, or Ireland, or whatever. And we're not required to forget what it extracted, and what it provoked, and the assumptions it's made, and the differences it made, and its terrible inability to see people living on this planet as equals. That is a reality, but it needn't stop us from achieving any ethical purpose we have either today or in the future. The story of the Connaught Rangers mutiny hasn't received enough attention in the official historiographical narrative of the revolutionary period. This is part of the neglect of social class in the history. People don't like to hear of the people who did not inherit land, the people who were in the shops, the trades, the people who emigrated, these others. There was something to go home to for many in the new state. There wasn't anything for a great deal more who emigrated. There were many others who had to try and reconstruct their lives in different ways. But we are now in 2021, when we should be able to put back all the stories of all of the people at different levels of class in our story for independence. And we should always remember, we wouldn't be here celebrating all of this if our independence had not been achieved. And that is something important. So we have the luxury, if you like, of entertaining ourselves with different versions of the motivations of people long ago, but we are still left with our own responsibility. As I have said for them, finally, this is a splendid day. And I have said we will strive for an ethical remembering that refuses any kind of conscious or unconscious amnesia, one that allows for us to be inclusive, for an ethics of narrative hospitality. I think an openness to others, an attempt to nurture memory, to be able to put new facts and new stories into the thing, and not feel that we are actually betraying anything or somehow making a judgment of others. We must abandon that kind of judgmentalism and look for an open history that is inclusive of all the stories, including not just the achievements, but the mistakes that we make. On this island, and indeed across Europe, there must be an openness to others. And I often mention nowadays, look how different it would be in the world if all those great imperial adventurers of Europe acknowledged the continents of Africa and Asia and Latin America and South America about what the price was paid for imperialist madness. So therefore, I think it is very important for us to try and take on, if you like, a generosity in relation to a multiplicity of narratives, allowing all narratives to be placed side by side, but also to be renovated and to be looked at. I believe that was John Hume's vision, for example, of an agreed shared future. I think it's wonderful to be out in the open air again talking about commemoration. One couldn't be in a better place than in Sligo. And this is a wonderful occasion. Tres Leas Cathaoirleach and made it up when Chamakaki. Urfai Jags and Queen in a land shiver near Quirin Cove Ship. So Berbanach is Gokman of Duntawaki. Mila buíochas as achtan cuireadh anseo. May I thank you for the invitation to be here on this very important day, and I congratulate you on having done it, but also on your patience, which is in effect a defeat of the circumstances of COVID. History won. Take care. God bless.
I now invite Mary Henry, Secretary of the Tubbercurry Connaught Rangers Memorial Group, to speak.
President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins and Sabrina Higgins, Leas Cathaoirleach Donal Gilroy, public representatives and distinguished guests, you're all welcome to our commemoration of the Connaught Rangers Mutiny in India, especially the descendants who have travelled from England and from all over Ireland. We have waited very long for this day. This is part of Sligo County Council's Decade of Centenaries, the state commemorating significant historic events that took place between 1918 and 1923. On behalf of our committee, I would like to express our gratitude to Donal Tenney, Michelle Brennan, and the staff of the library for their help in making this memorial event possible. And a very special thank you to James Daly for all his help, support. Des, it's very much appreciated. We'll never be able to repay you. This commemoration is designed to honour the memory of those courageous men who were far from home. They stood in solidarity with our fellow countrymen who were fighting for our independence and the establishment of the Irish Republic. My grandfather, James Gorman from Tubbercurry, better known locally as Jimmy, was one of the 4 Sligo men that took part in the mutiny. The others were Patrick Dyer from Ceish Ballymote, Jack Scanlon and Martin Conlon from Sligo town. When the news of the martial law and reprisals of the Black and Tans reached the Connaught Rangers in Jolander and Solon, they reacted by an act of simple defiance. They grounded arms and they refused to take orders. The Rangers were incarcerated in Dagshy prison while awaiting court-martial. It was here the first of them died, John Mirando. 14 of the Rangers were sentenced to death, but 13 had their sentences commuted to life in prison, and the others were given various terms of penal servitude to be served in English prisons. James Daly was executed on this day 100 years ago. He was the last member of the British Army to be executed for mutiny. Following the signing of the treaty, the mutineers were released from prison in January 1923 and they returned to Ireland. Stuck. They found that the old government and all its familiar traditions and public institutions were gone. Civil war was in progress. A new government with different public institutions was being established. The mutineers were treated as outcasts of the old system, and they were perceived as outsiders in the new system. This disconnect meant that their acceptance and integration into the new system was very slow and difficult. With their service pensions forfeited, many found it very difficult to get employment, and many of them became destitute. The story of the mutiny in India in 1920 highlighted Ireland's struggle for independence. The mutiny was reported to the wider international audience in India and in American papers. And indeed, followers of Mahatma Gandhi interpreted the mutiny as an example of passive resistance and civil disobedience. I believe Gandhi himself sympathised with the stand the mutineers took. The mutiny in India in 1920 had been airbrushed out of Irish history. In present-day school history books, when addressing the War of Independence, it rightly mentions the execution of Kevin Barry, on the 1st of November 1920, but there is no mention of the execution of James Daly on the 2nd of November 1920. Those two young men gave their lives for the same cause. But today marks a decisive change to the story of the Connaught Rangers. They will now be acknowledged and included into mainstream of Irish history. Today, Ireland honours the memory of those courageous men. And on behalf of the descendants, I wish to express our deep appreciation and gratitude to you, President Higgins, for unveiling our memorial and honouring the memory of the mutineers, and for your very passionate address. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. The President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, will now unveil the memorial to the Connaught Rangers. We will now observe a minute's silence in honour of the Connaught Rangers. I call on Margaret Lambert, granddaughter of James Gorman, to make a presentation to Sabina Higgins. I call on Mary Henry, on behalf of the Tubbercurry Connaught Rangers Memorial Group, to make a presentation to the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. On behalf of the descendants, Mary presents a copy of the personal, handwritten account of the Connaught Rangers Mutiny in India by Joseph Hawes, one of the leaders of the mutiny. It also includes a printed version of the account, courtesy of Catherine Millard, granddaughter of mutineer Joseph O'Donoghue. This presentation is an expression of their deep appreciation to President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, for his generous words of recognition of the brave actions their ancestors took in India in 1920, and for unveiling the memorial to their memory today. I call on Roger McCarrick, President of Tubbercurry Chamber of Commerce and Community Association, to make a presentation to the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. This gift is a set of 4 books compiled by Tubbercurry Active Retirement Association, marking President Higgins' patronage of Active Retirement Ireland. The gift also contains this year's edition of Sligo Field Club Journal, containing essays on the social and archaeological history of Tubbercurry and surrounds.